In this presentation, I'm going to talk about an unusual source for one-place study and one you possibly hasn't thought about before. That's guidebooks. Um, I've always been long interested in guidebooks, partly because going on holiday, but partly because I found them so useful as a description of a place maybe 100 years, 150 years, not so much necessarily a physical description of the place, but some idea about how it worked or how it worked at the time. So you get an idea of how to link things through or see it in the way that a visitor would have seen it. We all know, we've all probably used guidebooks on holiday from Lonely Planet or probably the best known, or Fowler or any of the others, Baedeker's, Murray's possibly, as well as the older ones. And they are a fascinating insight into places. That's why people buy them. They are give you an easy way of finding out about the best places to visit, the best places to eat, the best places to stay. Otherwise, certainly before the internet, it would have been very hard to find this information. And therefore, guidebooks are, as I say, a very useful source for local history, one which I tends to have been rather overlooked. It's partly because there's quite a lot of overlap between guidebooks and local histories, and as John Vaughan says, it's easier to recognise a guidebook than to define one. Most guidebooks contain a local history, certainly ones for England, so again, background information about the buildings and whatever else. They may well include maps, again, useful to have if you come into a town for the first time. A map can help you orientate yourself. There's often lists of hotels and restaurants and other things that duplicate and overlap with trade directories. The closest overlap, and it's quite a big one really, is with municipal guides, and that's something again nobody's ever really looked at. And these are guides published by local authorities about their areas. Again, it's a mixture of all the services provided locally, either by the council themselves or by local tradesmen and shopkeepers and so on and so forth, with a bit about local history aimed at people wanting to move into the area, or and again with half an eye on the tourist trade as well. So there's quite a lot of overlap with the guidebook and the guidebook itself. And these have other things in, and perhaps possibly you might say that the mixture is different in a guidebook than it would be to other sources. The earliest guidebooks for England, at least, start in the 1680s, and the first one is a French guide to London, published in 1685, and it was a mixture of a guide to the attractions of London. A French visitor coming to London, where would you go and see? And then together with suggestions of places to eat and to stay as well, clearly compiled by the writer, Monsieur Collinot, and clearly did reasonably well. There were subsequent editions, but clearly not that much demand for the trade, partly because of so few visitors, but partly because people would find other ways of finding information. But they begin to become more important in the 1740s onwards, when you get the growth of a tourist trade, people going out on holiday to various places and wanting some sort of guide to the place they want to visit. Again, a mixture of travelogue and guides to the local resources, or rather amateurish, it has to be said, nothing regimented, but I suspect were quite popular, quite informative for people who bought the guides. The best one that I know of is really a sort of early precursor to the Good Food Guide, is called the Epicure's Almanac, which was published in 1815 to the restaurants of London, and it lists hundreds of them, all done by one man, I suspect, and really sort of an interesting insight into places. And if you were time travelling back to London in 1850, where would you might go to, that sort of thing. with the arrival of the railway, with the arrival of mass tourism from the 1830s onwards, you begin to get the formulaic guides, of which Baedeker's with his red cover and Murray's with the blue cover are very good examples. That, again, they are very formulaic. They'll give you brief details of hotels in the town, lots of details of the key attractions with building details, or descriptions of key descriptions of the church, maybe key tombs in the church itself, other buildings in the town hall, wherever. Very formulaic, everywhere was the same, with well-drawn maps, but losing the idiosyncrasy, the personal touch of the older guides. But the older guides still continue to be published. Most printers in towns would have published a guide to the locality, sort of halfway between a trade directory as published by Kelly's or the Post Office directories, and a guide for tourists. Again, a mixture of stuff for the tourists and stuff for local people that you could buy and keep at home. So there'll be lists of attractions, list of hotels, restaurants and such things, as well as details of key shops that a visitor might want to visit, the local haberdasheries, the tailor shop and so on, as well as churches and chapels, an important feature for middle-class visitors of the period. And again, they may well include things like post times and train times and that sort of thing. So more useful probably for the locals than for visitors. And again, there will be maps and increasingly illustrations, either hand-drawn or photographs from the 1890s onwards. And of course, they would include adverts as well. And that, in some ways, is the most interesting thing these days. You can go where they boast about having hot and cold running water, or a toilet on every floor, and that sort of thing. So, a useful guide, well worth looking out for your local history. They are best, I think, for when tourism was a major business, like the seaside results of Brighton or Blackpool, or indeed places like Richmond, which got a lot of day travel. And again, most places I suspect will be mentioned, particularly in Baedeker's and Murray's, because if you have an interesting church, they're going to be mentioning it at some stage, even if it is you might also want to visit this category. It reflects the changing nature of tourism, from upper class people arriving by stagecoach, by their own coach, or by stagecoach, to mass excursions coming by train. And the guides reflect that changing nature to an extent. And of course, from our point of view as historians, they provide a good description of the places and the facilities available. But they're not for everybody. They were catered entirely for middle-class visitors who could afford to buy the guide, and that's what the publishers wrote the guides for. And they're quite repetitive. Edition after edition are much the same, so you don't need to go through all of them. And particularly the local history very rarely changes. Guides for Richmond in the 1970s were continuing, basically reproducing the same guff that had been published in the 1820s about the local history of Richmond, including the same mistakes. So, just said, nothing much changed. The language had been moderated, but changed, improved, but updated, but nothing else had changed really. The last couple of slides, which I have to go through very quickly, are where you can find, there's a lot online, particularly for the older ones, and physical copies can be found at local studies libraries and the British Library. And there are a couple of books that might help you. Probably the most useful thing from our point of view is probably the guidebooks as a source for social history in the amateur historian. It's very dated now, as you might expect, but it is quite interesting, and the Wikipedia entry is quite a good introduction to the subject as a whole. In conclusion, I hope that you'll find it useful. These books are well worth looking at, even if it's just a matter for amusement. So good luck and happy reading.